I was 8 months pregnant, sitting in a folding chair with a paper crown that said "Mommy to be" sliding sideways off my head, when my brother took the microphone meant for party games and turned my baby shower into his engagement party. That was shock number 1. Shock number 2 came 4 seconds later from the back of the room, in the form of a single sharp gasp from my Aunt Linda that cut through the applause like a dropped plate. "Wait," Linda said, standing up so fast her chair scraped the hardwood. "Amber." The room didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet in stages, the way a wave pulls back before it crashes. First the people closest to Linda, then the ripple moving outward until even my brother Derek, mid-sentence, mid-triumph, one arm still around his new fiancée's waist, trailed off and said, "What?" "Your name's Ashley," Linda said. She wasn't asking. She was staring at the woman standing next to my brother the way you stare at a face you've seen in a nightmare and then, impossibly, in your kitchen. "You told my sister-in-law's mother your name was Amber. Amber Whitlow. 2 years ago? In Dayton?" Quick question before I keep going, because I already know a lot of you are going to have opinions about this one. Where are you watching from right now? And be honest, would you have stayed in that folding chair and said nothing, or would you have wanted the whole room to stop and deal with it right then? I'll read some answers later because trust me, this story earns the reaction. Let me back up because I want you to have the full shape of that room before I tell you what happened next. My name is Nora Bellamy, Nora Vance, before I married my husband Sam 6 years ago, and that baby shower was supposed to be, by every normal measure, one of the good days. My mother Carol had spent 3 weeks planning it in her kitchen with sticky notes and a binder, the kind of over-involved joy she'd earned after 68 years of a life that hadn't always been easy. My brother Derek, 29, had flown in from Columbus with a woman he'd been dating for about 7 months. A woman named Ashley Prescott, who I had met exactly twice before that afternoon. Once at Thanksgiving, briefly, and once at a birthday dinner where she'd talked mostly to my mother and barely to me. Derek had asked 2 days earlier if he could say a few words at the shower. I'd assumed he meant a toast. A nice one maybe, about becoming an uncle. I did not assume he meant getting down on one knee in front of 30 of my friends and family at an event that was, by definition, about someone else, and proposing to a woman I barely knew at a party where I was the one wearing the paper crown. I want to be honest with you because honesty is the whole point of telling this story. My first reaction wasn't suspicion. It was hurt. It was the specific, small, embarrassing hurt of watching your own brother decide that your baby shower was an acceptable stage for his moment. And everyone clapping along like that was completely normal, like nobody else in the room, found it strange that a man had proposed at a party where the guest of honor was 8 months pregnant in a folding chair. That hurt lasted about 4 seconds, then Linda said Amber, and the whole afternoon tilted sideways into something else entirely. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ashley said. Her voice had changed, not dramatically, but enough. A half step higher, a little too fast. "You do, though," Linda said. "You sat in Marjorie Twofeather's kitchen and told her you could help manage her late husband's accounts because you used to work at a credit union. You told her your name was Amber Whitlow. I know because Marjorie is my husband's cousin, and I drove her to the bank 3 separate times to try to undo what you did to her before she finally just closed the accounts altogether." Derek's arm slid off Ashley's waist, slowly, like he was trying not to make it obvious. "Linda, that's a really specific accusation to make at somebody's baby shower," he said, and I noticed, even in the chaos of that moment, that he directed the comment at Linda's behavior, not at whether it was true. I think about that a lot because in the moment I didn't get a choice about how it played out. My mother made it for me. "Linda," my mother said, standing up from her chair by the gift table, her voice doing that particular calm butt-shaking thing it does when she's trying very hard not to cry in public. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure that's the same woman?" "I'm sure," Linda said. "I sat across from her at Marjorie's kitchen table. I remember her face. I remember she had a mole here." She touched her own jaw just below her left ear, same spot as her. "I don't forget faces, Carol, not after what she did to Marjorie." I looked at Ashley then, really looked at her, in a way I probably should have done 7 months earlier when Derek first brought her around. She had gone very pale, and her hand, the one now wearing a modest solitaire ring that Derek had apparently spent 3 months' savings on, based on what he'd bragged to my husband Sam the week before, was gripping her purse strap so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "This is insane," she said. "I've never even been to Dayton." Nobody in that room believed her. I could feel it. The way you can feel weather changing, 30 people simultaneously recalibrating what they thought they knew about a woman who, 5 minutes earlier, had just gotten engaged to someone they loved. My mother sat back down slowly, and I noticed her hand go to her chest in a way that worried me more than anything Linda had said. My mother, I should tell you now because it matters later, had been having some memory trouble over the previous year. Nothing anyone had put a name to yet, small things, misplaced keys, a forgotten doctor's appointment. The kind of thing you tell yourself is normal aging until it starts happening enough times that it isn't. And in that moment, watching my mother's face go the color of old paper, some instinct in me, some instinct I didn't fully understand yet, told me this wasn't really about a stolen engagement moment at my baby's shower anymore. Something much bigger and much colder had just walked into that room wearing a modest solitaire ring, and it had been sitting at our family's table for 7 months already. The party ended early. Not dramatically, nobody screamed, nobody threw cake, but the air had gone out of it the way it does when everyone in a room is thinking about the same uncomfortable thing and trying to pretend they're not. Derek left within 20 minutes, Ashley's hand gripped tightly in his jaw set in the particular stubborn line he'd had since childhood whenever he felt cornered. He didn't ask my mother or me what we thought. He didn't ask if we believed Linda. He just left, and the silence he left behind was worse than any argument would have been. I called my mother the next morning, ostensibly to thank her for the shower, actually to ask the question I hadn't been able to ask with 30 people still cleaning up paper plates around us. "Mom," I said, "has Ashley been around the house a lot before yesterday, I mean?" There was a pause on the line long enough that I knew the answer before she gave it. "She's been very sweet to me," my mother said, which wasn't an answer. "She helped me set up online banking last month. You know how I've been having trouble with the app since they changed it." Every hair on my arm stood up. "She set up your online banking," I repeated. "She's good with that kind of thing. She said she used to work in finance." My mother's voice had that slightly defensive quality it gets when she thinks I'm about to criticize a decision she's already a little unsure of herself. "Nora, I know what Linda said yesterday was upsetting, but Marjorie Two Feathers is 81 years old and gets confused about things. I don't think we should assume the worst about Derek's fiancée based on one conversation." I didn't push it that day. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I didn't push it because some part of me still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, that Ashley just happened to resemble a woman named Amber, that Linda's memory was playing tricks on her the way memories sometimes do after enough time has passed. I had a baby coming in 4 weeks. I had a nursery half painted and a husband working overtime to cover the maternity leave gap, and genuinely, honestly, I did not want to go looking for a family crisis on purpose. But 2 things happened over the following week that made it impossible to keep looking away. The first was that Linda called me directly, not my mother, 3 days after the shower. "I did some digging," she said. "I know I probably shouldn't have, but I couldn't stop thinking about your mom's face when I said that yesterday. Nora, I found Marjorie's old case. She actually filed a police report back in Dayton 2 years ago. It didn't go anywhere, no charges, insufficient evidence. The woman had already moved on and used a different bank branch by the time Marjorie's family caught the missing money. But there's a report. I have the case number." The second thing happened 4 days after that, when I stopped by my mother's house to drop off a car seat we'd bought in duplicate by accident, and found a stack of unopened mail on her kitchen counter, bank statements, 3 of them still sealed, from an account I didn't recognize the name of. When I asked her about it, she waved a hand. "Oh, that's the new savings account. Ashley helped me open it. Higher interest rate than my old one at the credit union," she said. "I haven't gotten around to looking at the statements yet, there's just been so much going on." "When did you open it?" "March, I think, or April." Derek and Ashley had started dating in October, 7 months before the shower. My mother had opened a new savings account with Ashley's help in March or April, 5 or 6 months into the relationship, well before any engagement, well before Ashley had any formal, permanent tie to our family. I asked my mother if I could see the statements. She hesitated, not because she was hiding anything consciously, I don't think, but because some small, stubborn part of her still wanted to protect the version of events where her son's fiancée was simply a kind, competent young woman helping an aging widow with her finances, not something worse. "She brings me soup when I have a cold," my mother said almost to herself while I turned the sealed envelopes over in my hands. She remembered my birthday before Derek did. She sat with me for 2 hours in April going through your father's old insurance paperwork, because I couldn't make sense of the beneficiary forms after the company changed their system. Each sentence came out a little quieter than the last, like she was listing evidence for a defense she was no longer sure she believed in herself. People don't do that if they're just using you, do they? I didn't have a good answer for her that day, standing in her kitchen with a car seat still in the trunk of my car outside and my daughter 3 weeks from being born. The honest answer, the one I only fully understood months later once Detective Ochoa explained how these patterns actually work, is that yes, people absolutely do that, and the soup and the birthday and the 2 patient hours with insurance paperwork weren't separate from the scheme. They were the scheme. They were the exact groundwork that made a $9,000 transfer look, on paper, like something my mother had willingly agreed to rather than something she'd been carefully walked toward for months. I don't want you to think I can't manage my own money, Nora, she said quietly, and that sentence broke my heart a little, because it told me she already suspected something was wrong and was more afraid of being seen as diminished than of the actual danger. I don't think that at all, Mom, I said. I think someone might be taking advantage of you. Those are very different things. She let me open the statements. The account had been opened with an initial deposit of $4,000 transferred from my mother's existing checking account. Over the following 4 months, there had been 6 more transfers into the new account, totaling an additional $11,200 money my mother, on a fixed income of Social Security and a modest pension from 30 years as a school administrator, could not easily explain having available to move around. And then, in the most recent statement, dated just 2 weeks before the shower, there was a single withdrawal, $9,000, transferred out to an account number that wasn't my mother's, wasn't Derek's, wasn't anything my mother recognized when I read the number aloud to her. I don't remember approving that, my mother said, and her voice had gone very small. That was the moment the second layer peeled back, the way these things always seem to happen, not all at once, but in pieces, each one worse than the last. It wasn't just that Ashley might have a troubling history with an elderly woman in Dayton 2 years earlier. It was that she had, over the 7 months of her relationship with my brother, systematically embedded herself into my mother's financial life, gained her trust, gained access to her accounts, and moved out $9,000 2 weeks before proposing to Derek in front of our entire family, as though the engagement itself was less a romantic milestone and more a kind of insurance policy, a way of cementing permanent access to a family she'd already started quietly draining. I called Sam, my husband, from my car in my mother's driveway, and I remember my hands were shaking so badly I had to put the phone on speaker and set it in the cup holder to dial. I think Derek's fiancée is stealing from my mom, I said before he'd even said hello. Sam is an accountant, not a forensic one, just a regular CPA who does small business taxes and occasionally helps friends untangle their finances after a divorce. And his first instinct, thankfully, was practical instead of panicked. Okay, he said, first thing, don't confront anyone yet. Second thing, get copies of everything. Every statement, every transfer, dates, amounts, account numbers. If this is what you think it is, we need a paper trail before anyone says a word to Derek or Ashley. Because the second they know you're looking, things get deleted, accounts get closed, and it becomes your word against hers. I spent the next several days doing exactly that, with my mother's full cooperation once she understood what was actually at stake. We went to her credit union together, and a very patient branch manager named Deborah Osai pulled 6 months of statements across both accounts and helped us build a timeline. Deborah also flagged something I hadn't caught on my own. The new savings account had been opened with Ashley present as a joint signer, not just a helpful bystander. My mother had, apparently without fully understanding the paperwork, added Ashley to the account with legal authority to move money independently. Do you remember signing that? Deborah asked gently. I remember Ashley bringing some papers for me to sign, my mother said. She said it was so she could help me if I ever had trouble with the online system. I didn't realize it meant she could take money out without asking me. I want to pause here, because I think this detail matters enormously for understanding how this kind of exploitation actually works in real life. Nobody handed my mother a document titled "Give this woman access to drain your savings" and asked her to sign it. It was framed gently and patiently over months as help, as convenience, as the kind of small, thoughtful gesture a devoted future daughter-in-law makes for an aging mother-in-law who struggles with technology. That's what made it work. That's what makes this kind of thing work on people far sharper than my mother, too. It doesn't look like a con from the inside. It looks like kindness, right up until it doesn't. Deborah also gave me something I hadn't expected. The account number the $9,000 had been transferred to 2 weeks before the shower, traced back to an account held under the name Ashley Renner, not Ashley Prescott, the name Derek had introduced her by for 7 months, and not Amber Whitlow, the name Linda remembered from Dayton 2 years earlier. 3 names, 1 woman. I called Linda back and gave her the name Ashley Renner. It took her 2 days, but she found something, a local news article from a small paper outside Dayton, 18 months old, about a different elderly resident, a man named Harold Vance, no relation to us. A strange coincidence of surnames that made my stomach drop for a full 10 seconds before I confirmed he wasn't family, who had lost nearly $20,000 to a woman he described to police as a kind young woman who'd been helping him with his bills. A woman he knew as Ashley Renner. That case, like Marjorie's, had gone nowhere. Harold had been reluctant to press charges, embarrassed. And by the time he came forward, the money had moved through enough accounts that local police told him it would be difficult to trace or recover. I found Harold's phone number through the reporter who'd written the article, a local journalist who still covered the county courthouse beat and remembered the case well enough to make an introduction. Harold was 79, widowed himself, living alone in a house he and his late wife had bought in 1974. And when I explained why I was calling, he went quiet on the line for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. I told my daughter I didn't want to talk about it anymore, he finally said. She still brings it up sometimes, like I should be angrier than I am. I think I used up all my anger the first year. Now it's mostly just, I don't leave my door unlocked anymore. That's the part nobody warns you about. It's not really about the money after a while. It's that you stop trusting the next kind person who shows up at your door, and you don't get that back. He agreed reluctantly to speak with Detective Ochoa once the case moved forward, though he told me plainly he had no interest in testifying if it came to a trial. He was tired, he said, and he'd already told this story to enough strangers with clipboards to last a lifetime. I understood that completely, and I made sure Detective Ochoa understood it too before anyone asked more of him than he had left to give. 2 victims, 2 different names, same woman, same pattern. Embed herself in the life of an aging, somewhat isolated person, offer help with finances framed as kindness, gain account access, drain funds slowly enough to avoid immediate suspicion, then disappear or move on before anyone connects the dots. Except this time, she hadn't disappeared. This time, she'd gotten engaged to my brother in front of 30 witnesses at my baby shower, which meant this time, for the first time in what appeared to be a 2-year pattern, she'd made herself impossible to simply walk away from without a fight. I debated for almost a week whether to bring this to Derek directly or to go straight to the bank's fraud department and let the institutional process handle it without giving him the chance to warn Ashley first. Sam and Deborah both gently pushed me toward the second option. The more people who know before the paperwork is filed, the more time she has to move money or disappear, Deborah said, but in the end, I couldn't do it. He was my brother. Whatever he'd done wrong, whatever blindness or desperation had led him here, I owed him one honest conversation before I went around him. I asked him to meet me alone, no Ashley, at a coffee shop halfway between our 2 lives, and he showed up defensive before I'd said a single word, arms crossed, jaw already set. If this is about Linda's little performance at the shower, it's about $9,000 that moved out of Mom's savings account 2 weeks before you proposed, I said. It's about an account Ashley has access to that Mom doesn't remember fully understanding when she signed the paperwork. It's about a police report in Dayton with a different last name attached to the same face Linda recognized. I'm not attacking you, Derek. I need you to actually look at this with me. I watched something happen in his face that I recognized from childhood, the exact expression he used to get right before getting caught in a lie as a kid, a kind of visible internal argument between what he wanted to believe and what he was starting to suspect. She told me about Dayton, he said quietly after a long silence. Not the way you're describing it. She said she used to help elderly clients with financial planning, informally, before she got her license, and one of them accused her of something after his family got involved and didn't like that he trusted her more than them. She said it got blown out of proportion. I believed her. Did she tell you her name used to be Amber or Ashley Renner? His face went pale in a way that told me clearly that this part he hadn't known. What? The account the money went into is under the name Ashley Renner, not Prescott. Linda's cousin knew her as Amber Whitlow. That's 3 different names for the same woman, Derek, and 2 different families who say she drained their savings using the exact same method she's been using on Mom for 7 months. He didn't defend her after that, not really. He just went very quiet, staring at his coffee, and I could see him doing the same mental arithmetic I'd been doing for a week. Recalculating every small, sweet thing Ashley had done for our mother, wondering how much of it had been genuine affection and how much had been careful, patient groundwork. I love her, he finally said, which wasn't a denial, and I think we both understood that. I know, I said. I'm not asking you to stop loving her. I'm asking you to help me protect Mom's money, and honestly, Derek, I think you might need protecting too. If she's done this to 2 other families, there's no reason to think you're any different, other than the fact that she actually agreed to marry you this time. That doesn't mean you're the exception. It might just mean you were the biggest opportunity. That sentence landed harder than I intended it to, and I watched my brother's eyes go wet in a way I hadn't seen since our father's funeral 11 years earlier. Whatever else was true about Derek, and there was plenty to be frustrated with, his instinct to defend her first and ask questions later, his willingness to let a relationship move that fast without doing basic due diligence. He was not, I came to believe over the following months, a co-conspirator. He was a target who happened to also be my brother, and the fact that his blindness had put our mother's savings at risk didn't make him a villain. It made him, in his own way, another one of Ashley's victims, just a later stage one, further along in the con than my mother, engaged instead of simply account-linked. We went to the bank's fraud investigation department together, my mother, myself, and eventually Derek, once he'd had 2 more days to sit with what I'd told him and finally, painfully, look at his fiancée's phone history and financial claims with something other than trust as the default setting. The fraud investigator, a methodical man named Tobias Reyes who'd clearly seen this exact pattern more times than he probably wanted to count, walked us through what would happen next. Because my mother had, technically, authorized Ashley as a joint signer on the account, even though that authorization had been obtained through what Tobias called a pattern consistent with undue influence and possible financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Recovering the money wasn't as simple as just calling it theft and reversing the transfer. This is going to move through a few different channels, Tobias explained. The bank can freeze further activity on the account immediately and open an internal fraud investigation, which we're doing today. But full recovery, especially once funds have moved to a third account, usually requires either a police report and criminal investigation, or your mother pursuing a civil claim, or both. I'd also strongly recommend contacting your county's Adult Protective Services office, given her age and the pattern of behavior you're describing, even without a formal cognitive diagnosis. Financial exploitation of an older adult who was targeted specifically because of trust building over time falls squarely within what they investigate. That was the moment the story stopped being just a family drama and became, formally, an institutional one: bank fraud department, police financial crimes unit, and adult protective services, 3 separate systems now involved in untangling 7 months of careful, patient manipulation. The police report was, in some ways, the hardest part, because it meant my mother had to sit across a table from a financial crimes detective named Renata Ochoa and describe, in detail, every way she'd trusted Ashley, the online banking help, the better interest rate savings account, the joint signer paperwork she now understood she hadn't fully read. My mother cried twice during that interview, not from grief exactly, but from a kind of shame I wished I could have taken from her. The shame of feeling foolish for trusting someone who had worked very hard over many months to make trusting her feel completely reasonable. Detective Ochoa was kind about it in a way that helped. "Mrs. Vance," she said, "I want to be very clear with you. The people who do this professionally, and based on what your family has found, this does look professional, practiced, repeated across at least 2 other victims. They are specifically skilled at making intelligent, careful people feel safe trusting them. This isn't a story about you being careless. It's a story about someone who studied exactly how to not seem like a threat. Adult Protective Services opened a parallel case within the week, assigned to a caseworker named Priya Nakamura, whose job, she explained on her first visit to my mother's house, wasn't to determine guilt, that was the police department's job, but to assess whether my mother was currently safe, whether she had adequate support, and whether any diminished capacity had contributed to her vulnerability in a way that needed ongoing monitoring. That visit came with its own quiet sting. My mother had to sit through a cognitive screening, simple questions, a memory recall test, a request to draw a clock face showing a specific time, administered gently but administered nonetheless in her own kitchen by a stranger with a clipboard, 4 weeks after her son's engagement had fallen apart in front of the whole family. The results were mild, enough irregularity to warrant a follow-up with her regular physician, not enough to indicate anything close to full dementia, but the process itself was its own small grief. I sat with her afterward while she made tea with hands that weren't quite steady and said, "I feel like I failed some kind of test just by being asked to take it." And I didn't have a good response to that because in a sense, she wasn't wrong. Being investigated for your own vulnerability, even gently, even by people trying to help, doesn't feel like protection while it's happening. It feels like being quietly filed under at risk for the rest of your life, whether or not you ever fully agree that's what you are. The investigation, once formally opened, moved the way these things actually move in real life, which is to say, slowly, with long stretches of silence punctuated by small updates that rarely felt as dramatic as you'd want them to. Detective Ochoa connected with a detective in the Dayton case from 2 years earlier, confirming that the woman known there as Amber Whitlow matched physical descriptions, and once fingerprint records from an old traffic stop were compared, was almost certainly the same person now living locally as Ashley Prescott. Harold Vance's case from 18 months earlier involving the name Ashley Renner also got reopened for comparison. It took 6 weeks just to get a formal identity confirmation. Her legal name, it turned out, was Deanna Kessler, 34 years old, with a sealed juvenile record in a different state and a pattern, going back at least 6 years based on what investigators could piece together, of moving between small and mid-sized towns, forming relationships, sometimes romantic, sometimes simply befriending isolated elderly people directly, gaining financial access, extracting money over a period of months, and relocating before the pattern became undeniable. I gave birth to my daughter, Josephine, in the middle of all of this, 3 weeks after the shower, right on schedule, in a hospital room where my phone kept buzzing with updates from Detective Ochoa that I mostly ignored for 48 hours because some things, even in the middle of a family crisis, deserve to be protected. I remember holding her for the first time and thinking, with a strange, exhausted clarity, that I now understood something about my mother's vulnerability that I hadn't fully understood before. How love makes you willing to trust in ways that can be exploited, and how that isn't a weakness so much as the necessary cost of being able to love people at all. Derek broke off the engagement 9 days after our coffee shop conversation, not dramatically, not with an ultimatum or a scene. He simply told Ashley, alone in the apartment they'd started sharing, that he knew about Dayton, about Ashley Renner, about the $9,000, and that he needed her to move out. I didn't hear this secondhand from Derek. I heard it from Detective Ochoa 3 weeks later, because Derek, and this is the part of this story I'm proudest of, the part that told me my brother, whatever mistakes he'd made, still had the right instincts underneath the blindness, had quietly started recording their subsequent conversations once he suspected she might try to explain her way out of it, and had turned those recordings over to the police. In one of those recordings, which Detective Ochoa later confirmed became a meaningful piece of evidence in the eventual case, Ashley, Deanna, didn't deny the Dayton allegations outright. Instead, according to the transcript excerpt Derek later shared with me, she tried a different approach entirely. She told him that families like yours have more money than they know what to do with anyway, that she'd never taken more than people could afford to lose, and that if he really loved her, he'd understand that everyone does what they have to do to survive. That recording did more to convince Derek of the full scope of what had happened than anything Linda, my mother, or I had said in the weeks prior, because it wasn't a denial. It was a justification, and justifications, unlike denials, tend to only exist when there's actually something to justify. I won't pretend Derek arrived at that certainty in a straight line. He called me twice during that 9-day window between our coffee shop conversation and the actual breakup, both times sounding like a man trying to talk himself back into a version of events where none of it was as bad as it looked. Once he floated the idea that maybe Ashley had simply had a difficult past, a family member who genuinely accused her unfairly once, and that the coincidence of a second alias was somehow explainable. I didn't argue with him those 2 times. I just asked him to wait for the bank's internal findings before deciding anything permanently, and he did. And I think that patience, his, not mine, is part of why he ended up with usable evidence instead of just a broken heart and no case to show for it. Derek gave the police everything, bank app screenshots showing Ashley had, in the days after the shower once she realized the alias had been exposed, attempted 2 additional transfers out of the joint account before the bank's freeze caught them. Text messages spanning their relationship that read with new eyes showed a slow, patient escalation of financial questions disguised as casual interest. Even a notebook he found in a drawer of their shared apartment, after she'd moved out, containing what appeared to be handwritten notes about my mother's finances, approximate account balances, her pension amount. Notes about trust building, slow and wait for engagement talk before second act. That notebook, more than anything else in the entire case, was the piece of evidence that turned this from a messy, ambiguous family situation into something prosecutors could actually build a criminal case around. It wasn't opportunism. It wasn't a woman who happened to fall into a bad pattern out of financial desperation, sympathetic as that might have been. It was a plan, written down, tracked and adjusted over months, targeting a specific vulnerable person with specific patience. I wish I could tell you that once the notebook surfaced, everything moved quickly and cleanly toward a satisfying resolution. It didn't. Financial exploitation cases involving elderly victims move in most jurisdictions at a genuinely frustrating pace, and ours was no exception. It took 4 months for the county prosecutor's office to formally decide to pursue charges: theft from an elderly or disabled adult, a felony under state law given the amount involved, plus a separate charge related to the fraudulent joint signer authorization, which prosecutors argued had been obtained through misrepresentation. During those 4 months, Deanna Kessler was released on bond after her arrest, and according to Detective Ochoa, had already relocated once, though she was required to check in regularly and hadn't fled the jurisdiction entirely, likely because doing so would have triggered a bond violation and made everything worse for her legally. My mother had to give a second, more formal statement for the prosecution, and then a third when the case was assigned to a new assistant prosecutor after the first one left the office for private practice. A frustrating, almost darkly comic bureaucratic hiccup that meant retelling the entire humiliating story a third time to someone new. Each retelling cost her something. I watched my mother over those months become quieter, more careful about her own judgment in ways that broke my heart even as I understood exactly why it was happening. The civil side moved separately, and in some ways, more usefully, a consumer protection attorney my mother hired, on a partial contingency basis, helped her file a civil claim to recover the missing funds, which was ultimately easier to make progress on than the criminal case, since it required only a preponderance of evidence rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. 9 months after the shower, my mother recovered $6,000 of the original $9,000 taken in the final transfer. The rest had already moved through accounts that were harder to trace and recover, a detail that still, honestly, makes me angry every time I think about it. The $11,200 that had moved into the joint savings account earlier, before the final large withdrawal, was fully recovered, since it had never actually left my mother's control in a way the bank couldn't simply reverse once the fraud was confirmed. The criminal case, at the 14-month mark from the day of my baby shower, resulted in a plea agreement rather than a trial. Deanna Kessler pled guilty to the theft charge in exchange for the prosecution dropping the fraudulent authorization charge and recommending a reduced sentence. A decision the assistant prosecutor explained to us was largely about certainty. A guilty plea gets your mother a formal restitution order and a documented conviction without the risk and expense of trial, she told us. A trial might get a longer sentence if we win, but there's real risk of an acquittal or hung jury too, especially with a defendant who's good at presenting sympathetically to juries, which by all accounts, she is. Deanna received 18 months with the possibility of parole after 9 given it was officially her first adult conviction, the Dayton and other town cases had never resulted in charges, which meant legally. They didn't exist as prior convictions, only as pattern evidence that had helped the prosecution's case but that she'd never actually been held accountable for until now. That detail sat uneasily with me for a long time. The fact that two other families, Marjorie Two Feathers and Harold Vance, never got their own day of formal accountability, that this conviction existed almost by accident of geography and timing, because this time she happened to get engaged to someone whose sister happened to have an aunt with a very good memory for faces. There was one setback in that final stretch that still bothers me more than almost anything else in the case. 3 months before the plea deal, Deanna's defense attorney filed a motion to suppress the recordings Derek had made, arguing that our state's two-party consent laws for recorded conversations meant the audio couldn't be used, since Ashley hadn't known or agreed to being recorded during a private conversation in what had, at the time, still been their shared home. For 9 anxious days, it looked like the single most damning piece of evidence in the entire case might simply disappear from the record on a technicality. The assistant prosecutor eventually persuaded the judge that an exception applied, because part of the recorded conversation had occurred with the apartment door open and a neighbor visible in the hallway, meeting the state's threshold for a place where privacy couldn't reasonably be expected, a razor-thin legal distinction that, had it gone the other way, would have gutted the case back down to circumstantial pattern evidence and my mother's word against a woman with 3 names and no fixed history. I remember Sam telling me, after we got the news that the recordings would stay in, that this was exactly the kind of moment nobody puts in the version of these stories people tell at dinner parties. The part where a case that felt, by then, morally certain very nearly fell apart over a legal formality that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence at all. The first Christmas after Josephine was born, 14 months after the baby shower, my mother said something to me in her kitchen while we were doing dishes that I've thought about more than almost anything else from that entire year. "I keep trying to figure out what I would have done differently," she said. "If I'd read the paperwork more carefully, if I'd asked more questions when she offered to help with the account. I go over it and over it. Mom, she did this to 2 other people before you. People who weren't recovering from losing Dad, who weren't dealing with early memory stuff, who had every reason to be more careful than you were in that specific window and still didn't catch it until it was too late. This isn't about what you did wrong. I know that's true when you say it," she said. "It's harder to believe it when it's just me alone thinking about it at 2 in the morning. I didn't have a perfect answer for that because I don't think there is one. I think that's part of what this kind of crime actually does. It doesn't just take money, though it takes plenty of that. It takes a piece of someone's trust in their own judgment, and that piece doesn't come back just because a court case resolves and a check arrives in the mail." Derek was there that Christmas too, quieter than usual, and at one point, while Josephine slept in a bouncer near the tree, he told me something he hadn't said before. "I keep thinking about how close I came to marrying her," he said. "Not just losing money, marrying her, building an actual life with someone who had a notebook with Mom's pension amount written in it, planning how fast she could ask for account access based on how the relationship was progressing." "You didn't marry her," I said. "You figured it out late, but you figured it out, and you're the one who got the recordings and the notebook that actually made the criminal case possible. That matters, Derek. That's not nothing." He didn't fully accept that comfort, not that Christmas, maybe not ever completely. I think some part of my brother will always carry the specific, quiet shame of having been the entry point for someone to nearly get permanently embedded in our family's finances and our mother's trust. I understand that shame. I don't think it's entirely fair to him, given how skilled and practiced his fiancée turned out to be at exactly this kind of manipulation, but I understand why it lingers anyway. Aunt Linda came by for coffee the week after that Christmas, and I finally asked her something I'd wondered about for over a year but never quite found the right moment to bring up. How she'd been so certain in the space of a single glance across a crowded room, when the rest of us people who'd actually spent months around Ashley hadn't noticed anything at all. "I wasn't certain," Linda admitted. "For about 2 seconds I almost talked myself out of saying anything, because what if I was wrong? What if it really was just a resemblance and I humiliated your family for nothing at a baby shower? But then I thought about Marjorie sitting in my car crying because she didn't know how she was going to tell her kids what happened to her savings, and I thought, if there's even a chance, I'd rather be wrong out loud than quiet and right." She wrapped both hands around her mug. I've thought about that a lot since. How close I came to just letting the moment pass to keep things pleasant. I think about that a lot too, how much of what protected my family that day came down to one woman deciding, in real time, that an uncomfortable truth spoken too loudly was better than a comfortable silence that let something keep growing in the dark. Here's what I keep coming back to. Almost 2 years removed from the day my brother took a microphone meant for baby shower games and turned it into a proposal, and my Aunt Linda's voice cracked the whole afternoon open with a single word. Amber, I used to think betrayal in families looked like a single dramatic act, a lie finally exposed, a secret finally spoken. What I learned that year is that the kind of betrayal that does the most lasting damage is usually slower and quieter than that. It's built in small increments of trust, offered so gently and so patiently that by the time you notice the pattern, months or years have already passed, and the person doing it has already moved 3 steps ahead of you. I also learned something about my family that I don't think I'd fully understood before, that Linda's gasp in that room wasn't an interruption of the good day I thought I was having. It was, in its own strange way, the actual gift of that baby shower, more valuable than any of the wrapped boxes stacked on the table. If she hadn't recognized that face, if she'd stayed quiet to avoid an awkward scene the way so many of us are trained to do at family gatherings, my mother might have lost far more than $9,000 before anyone caught what was happening. My brother might have actually married a woman who kept a notebook tracking how fast she could ask for access to his mother's pension. The room's reaction that day wasn't what my brother expected, because he'd walked in expecting congratulations and got, instead, the sound of a family finally catching something that had been quietly happening in plain sight for months. I don't think that's a tragedy, even though it felt like one in the moment, sitting in that folding chair with my paper crowns sliding off my head. I think it might be the closest thing to lucky that this particular story had to offer. My daughter is almost 2 now. She has no idea, and won't for a long time, that the year she was born was also the year her grandmother learned not to trust her own judgment quite so easily, and her uncle learned how close love can bring you to the edge of something you never saw coming. I hope when she's old enough to understand any of this, that what she takes from it isn't caution dressed up as fear. I hope she takes something closer to what my mother eventually managed to hold onto on her better days. That trusting people is still worth doing. Even after you've been shown exactly how it can be used against you, you just hopefully get a little better at knowing which gasps in a quiet room are worth listening to. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or to actual events is purely coincidental. It was created for entertainment and reflective purposes only. Takeaway: the people worth trusting rarely need months of careful groundwork before you feel safe with them. Patience, that patient is its own kind of warning sign.